Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to our Genshin Impact patch 5.2 second half battle review. Neuvillette is coming back, Zhongli is coming back, and the Forza characters are Heizou, Fischl, and Yaoyao. There is a lot to say about this, so let's just get right into it. First, let's talk about Neuvillette. One of the biggest factors that should go into one's decision on whether or not they go for Neuvillette on his rerun is the Mavuika leaks. And so the Neuvillette section of this video will talk about Mavuika leaks. So right now, I think there's no doubt that Neuvillette is the best carry in the game. That isn't to say that he will always be the character who performs the best out of any carry, but he's always pretty damn close. And whereas other characters have a bunch of gameplay issues, he just has gameplay non-issues. Everything about his kit works very well. And that puts him in a position where he's pretty much always going to work. The only time when he doesn't work is when the enemy is just straight up immune to Hydro. Even enemies with high Hydro resistance are pretty easy for Neuvillette to deal with because he has a bunch of teams that run an insane amount of shred, which makes Hydro resistance kind of irrelevant. So why is that? Like what is it that makes him so good? And should him being this strong mean that you go for him? I guess we can start with that second part. I think it's important to remember that Genshin is a single player game where the amount of rewards you have access to for content clearing is not proportional to how strong you are. Or rather, it's not directly proportional to how strong you are. You can make an account right now and a week from now be able to clear floor 10 of Abyss. If you like actually play a bunch and get through the Archon quest and get your adventure rank high enough that you can actually level up your characters, a casual player can get to Abyss 11 in like a month, as long as they actually play. And the rewards for each floor of Abyss after 8 is the same, right? Floor 9, 10, 11, and 12 all give you the same amount of rewards, which means that an incredibly well-built day one account is getting like 33% more reward than someone who can only clear floor 11. It is such a small difference. That means that the real incentive for building your characters isn't actually reward based. You don't build your characters because you want to get more rewards. You build your characters because you want the satisfaction of being able to complete the content. And because that satisfaction is going to be different from person to person, there's not going to be anyone that can, from the hours looking in, tell you how important it is for you to get a strong account. You're the only person who'll be able to figure that out for yourself. When it comes to getting an account as strong as possible, going for Neuvillette is a very good idea. However, if you don't like him, that might be enough for you to just be like, well, I don't care. If you don't have the primos to get him, you might be completely fine just not getting him. For a lot of people, getting a stronger account won't be worth spending actual money. And I really want to avoid any situation where someone feels like they have to swipe and go for a character because of one of my videos. Do not spend money on this shit game. That being said, it is unavoidable that any discussion around Neuvillette will make him seem quite good because he is quite good. So with that out of the way, let's talk about what actually makes him good. So the first thing that you care about when you look at a carry's performance is how much damage they do. And when it comes to Neuvillette, his damage is competitive with the other best teams in the game. Pretty much no matter what sort of content you're up against, unless it's Hydro immune, a Neuvillette team will be one of your strongest options when it comes to C0 5-star characters. Unlike a lot of the other carries that perform that well in terms of damage though, he also has a lot of little upsides that make his gameplay much more comfortable than other characters. So the first thing, which is probably the most obvious one, is that he's an HP scaler. HP scalers, and I guess defense scalers as well for that matter, have the very obvious upside of being tankier. It will be easier for you not to die when you're playing them than if you're playing an attack scaler. If two characters do the same amount of damage, the HP scaler has an advantage because they also have more HP. Now, he does consume his own HP, but he only consumes his own HP down to 50%. And because he builds so much HP, down to 50% is still over 20k HP or around 20k HP. Maybe if you're going for a signature, which is a weapon that doesn't give him a bunch of HP like Proto Amber, maybe then you're not gonna have that much HP, but you're still gonna be around like 40k-ish HP, which means that at 50%, you're at around 20k HP, which is about as tanky, if not tankier, than other characters. And then on top of that, he heals 50% of his HP every time he starts a charge attack. Every time he picks up these balls, bam, back to max HP. While his damage is technically a bit lower if he gets hit, because he has a passive that increases his damage based on his current HP, it's really not that significant. So even if you're low HP, he still does most of his damage. With his high HP pool plus his healing, he's effectively the tankiest carry in the game, and it's not even close. He can heal like 20k HP 4 times per rotation. It's an insane amount of healing that he can get, plus the fact that he's at a baseline very tanky. That's the first part. Defensively, you won't die with him. Like it's hard to die with him. The second part is the way that his AoE functions. If you look at the shape of Neuvillette's AoE, it's only a straight line in front of him, right? However, because there's no auto-targeting involved, and because you can freely move relatively quickly while shooting his beam, unless the enemies are in a f***ing triangle shape all around you, there's almost always a way to hit, at the very least, most of them with your AoE. Without any grouping, we can still hit pretty much all the enemies we need to hit without having to think about it too much. You don't have to worry too much about grouping RNG, enemy AI, any of that. You can just shoot your beam and the enemies die. On top of that, he has good range, and while you can't aim his beam straight up, you can aim it upwards enough that you can hit most airborne enemies. Yeah. All right, so you can hit it relatively easily while it's flying. And because you have a lot of range, you can stay away from attacks like that one while still dealing damage to it. Another thing that makes him so good, on top of all the things I've already mentioned, is that because of his ability to consolidate his AoE so well, and because of his passive that gives him more damage based on triggering different Hydro-related reactions, even if you don't play his best teams, he's still gonna perform okay. His best teams pretty much all have Farina, but Farina's a Hydro character, which means that's one less Hydro-related reaction you can trigger. Which means if you're not running Farina, you're losing out on Farina, sure, but in exchange for that, you gain that additional stack of his passive, which means that the gap between the Farina teams and the other teams isn't as high as it otherwise could be. All right, we're gonna go about as scuffed as you can get, okay? Any Animo character for VV, and then 2 characters that can trigger Hydro-related reactions, just so that you maintain good uptime on your stacks. And even against a high Hydro resistance enemy like this one, we still clear in a relatively reasonable time. And this is about as scuffed as it gets when it comes to teams, and you still get reasonable clear times, even in bad matchups. The point is just that even if you don't have the tools to make him as strong as he possibly can be, he still won't be bad. He'll just not be as good as he can be. And hell, even if you don't get his passive, you can still use a Hydro character just for Hydro Resonance, and it'll still be okay. All this to say, right, another important advantage that Neuvillette has over other carries is that even his shit teams are honestly reasonable. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all the big things that make him so good. Now, here's where we get into talking about Mavuika. In her first beta version, Mavuika was incredibly broken Omega power creep to every carry in the game, even Neuvillette. Since then, she got a pretty massive nerf. They gutted her charge attack, and she's still really strong. Looking at her output, there's still an argument to be made that as of her most recent beta version with V3, if she gets released in this stage, she'll be the best carry in the game. However, she still doesn't have all of the nice quality of life things that Neuvillette does. When we talk about her potentially being the best carry, it's in terms of her damage output and her damage output alone. She's a reaction-based pyro carry that isn't an HP scaler and has an AoE that is much smaller, or not much smaller, but that is much harder to hit, to consolidate, and to hit enemies with than Neuvillette. Because of that, I would say that as of V3, I don't think she's stronger than Neuvillette. But she is probably the closest character to Neuvillette in terms of carries. I think that right now in the live game, Neuvillette is by a pretty large margin the best carry in the game. Once Mavuika comes out, I think that margin gets reduced. If you like Mavuika, if you're one of the 3 ZJF viewers who actually likes Mavuika's design, good for you, I guess. If you like her and you like her a lot more than Neuvillette, going for her instead of Neuvillette, I don't think will make your account feel like you're missing something. But between the two, and keep in mind, right, I haven't done any testing on her yet, so this is still just guessing based on leaks. Between the two, I would probably lean more towards Neuvillette. Do keep in mind, she's still in beta. Her kit is not finalized at all. There could still be changes. Every Monday is a beta patch. If you wanna check out how strong she currently is, look up Hakushin Genshin site. Get to this one. Scroll down to diff, select Mavuika, and compare 5.2.52 to whatever the newest version is. If there have been any changes, right, as you can see between 5.51 and 5.52, you will be able to see the numbers changes, right? So as we can see from V2 to V3, her charge attack damage went from 217 to 195, and her burst buff per War God or per Fighting Spirit point went from 1.44 to 1.02. So all of that being said, Neuvillette is one of the stronger characters, if not the current strongest character in the game, and getting him makes pretty much every content feel pretty easy. In my experience, the biggest downside to Neuvillette is that he's a bit too brain dead to play, and that makes him a bit boring sometimes. But honestly, that is not a bad downside to have. I guess, wait, before we move on, we can talk about his comparison to Mualani as well. Mualani is a character whose damage profile is much more front-loaded, right? She gets a big nuke and then that's it. If she gets a big nuke a few times and that's it. She's a lot more setup reliant, so she's much harder to play. And also, it is a lot easier for things to go wrong. Mualani is a great carry for speedruns, but when it comes to casual gameplay, she's honestly relatively average. On top of that, one big issue that front-loaded damage characters have that Neuvillette doesn't is overkill. Teams where you have a lot of damage in a short period of time generally don't end up killing the enemy exactly with the right amount of damage, right? Maybe you do 3 250k chomps on Mualani for 750k damage, and the enemy has 900k HP, and then you have to set up a whole ass other rotation for it, or with your burst, whatever, you do 1 million, a little bit over that, but the enemy has 1.2 million, and then you have to set up a whole other rotation for it. Characters like Neuvillette, who have damage that is much more sustained, always end up killing the enemy pretty much exactly with the amount of damage they need, and whatever leftover damage can be sent to the next wave of enemies. That's another upside that I haven't actually talked about yet. But honestly, the biggest reason why I don't think Moani is better than Neuvillette is that even in speedrunning, Neuvillette is still a great character. If Neuvillette was a character who just wasn't very good in speedruns, then I think it would be reasonable to say like, yeah, sure, there's enough situations where Moani is better that it's reasonable to say she's just a better character. Right? It depends on what you care about. But Neuvillette is still a pretty good speedrun character. So to me, it's really hard to justify. Anyways, let's talk about Zhongli. Zhongli is a character whose value depends heavily on the player more so than the account. There are not many, if any, teams where Zhongli is optimal in terms of output. However, there are quite a few carries who do not have comfortable teams unless you have Zhongli, or at the very least, whose teams with Zhongli are much more comfortable. That isn't every character though. I think a lot of people perceive Zhongli as this character that is like just the best defensive option for every team. And while he is a good defensive option for every team, I think there's some teams where he's a lot more useful than others. Right? So if you look at a few different carries, you look at Xiao. Xiao is a character who doesn't really need defensive options because most enemies can't really hit you very much when you're in the air, and when you're landing you're staggering most enemies, and if it's a boss then you only have one enemy that you need to focus on, so it's a lot easier to dodge their attacks. But if you do need a defensive option, Zhongli will be good. Ganyu, yeah, Zhongli's a really good defensive option for her. Hu Tao, unironically, Zhongli isn't really that great as a defensive option for her. He's not bad, and there aren't that many good offensive options in the last slot when you're playing Hu Tao double Hydro, which means that even if Zhongli isn't really that important, it's still fine to use him. But defensively, Hu Tao isn't actually a character that is that easy to die with because of her high HP pool and the fact that you can just run Sing To with her. Even if she's not full HP, she doesn't tend to be so squishy or so in need of resistance to interruption that Zhongli is that important for her. But Zhongli is still reasonable. Let's only talk about good carries. I'm kidding. I mean, for her, while Zhongli is the best defensive option, there are other defensive options that do so much more for her teams because of how energy hungry she is. And so characters like Diona that generate a lot of particles, you'd probably rather run them. Ayaka doesn't really need defensive options because you're either playing against freezable enemies and they aren't hitting you, or against non-freezable enemies and you shouldn't be playing Ayaka to begin with. And even if you're playing Ayaka against non-freezable enemies, because of her high burst cost, same thing as Layla. Yoimiya is a character that actually quite likes Zhongli, for sure. Raiden doesn't really need Zhongli, nor does she really want him. She wants characters that can stack her resolve, and Zhongli has a 40 cost burst, which doesn't stack a lot of resolve. That on top of that has a really long animation. On top of that, she gets infinite resistance to interruption during her burst state, and you're almost always playing her with a healer. So the upsides of running a shielder become much less important. Ito teams, Zhongli's good in Ito teams as long as you're not playing Shilonen. Ayato teams don't really have enough damage if you're using Zhongli. Sino teams, I guess, is kind of the same, but like Sino teams generally prefer running characters that contribute to reactions in some way. You'd rather run shielders like Baiju, who's like a pseudo shielder really, but still, or Tome that actually help you with your reactions. Wanderer, Zhongli is fine with him, but if what you're looking for is a shielder option, I think both Lila and Tome tend to be better. Lila is technically the best shielder offensively if you're able to get both the cryo and the pyro buff from Wanderer's skill or passive. I don't remember if you get it from the skill or passive, but whatever. The buff from the crit rate buff and the attack buff from cryo and pyro respectively. But that requires specific setups with Lila, so not everyone's going to be able to do it properly. That being said, if you're not, you can still run Tome. and Tome is going to give you pyro resonance, and maybe more importantly, pyro particles that are going to make Bennett's burst easier to get. Wanderer's particle generation, especially if you don't have C6 Farazan in his teams, is like completely ass, and you'll often run into situations where you don't have enough particles for Bennett, even if he's on 250 ER. And so running shielders like Tome that help Bennett's particles, especially if Tome's C6 and where he buffs normal attack damage, will generally honestly be better than running Zhongli. Characters like Heizou tend to struggle to have the slots for Zhongli in their teams. Linny is a character who likes Zhongli in his teams for sure when it comes to defensive options. Risley struggles to have the slot in his teams. Neuvillette likes Zhongli, but Zhongli is not the only shield option. Navia likes Zhongli. But as you can see, right, I'm not going to go through all of them. The part I want to illustrate is just, while Zhongli is a good defensive option, and he does work, like he does function in pretty much every team, he isn't the best defensive option in every team, right? And even if he has the biggest shield in the game, the size of a shield isn't the only thing that matters. It's not just about the size, it's also about how you use it. And Zhongli's not very good at using it. What do you want me to say, man? All of that being said, defensive options are a lot more important than they used to be. Enemies nowadays fucking hit hard. Tolpa can one-shot you if you're standing in Bennett Burst. And having access to strong defensive options is a lot more important than it was when Zhongli was released. When Zhongli was released, not only was dying a lot harder, it was pretty much impossible to die if you were standing in Bennett Burst or if you were getting healed by something, because enemies weren't out DPSing your healing. And on top of that, that was when he was released, his shield was much weaker. So like, yeah. But now that's not really the case anymore. So defensive options have definitely gained in value over time. One thing I guess I need to mention though is, and we're going to start talking about leaks again. I'm sorry, I kind of forgot about this for a minute. There are 2 shielders coming next patch. And unironically, as of beta v3, both of them are looking pretty strong. We have Citlali and Lanyan. Honestly, one of the biggest reasons why they're both good is that both of them are catalysts, which means they can both use TTDS, which is kind of a big deal actually. Lanyan is a catalyst animal shielder, which means that she can use VV and TTDS. And that's going to mean that she can take Zhongli's place in a lot of teams where you're currently using Zhongli just to make stuff kind of more brain dead. Namely, Arlecchino, Mono Pyro teams, whether you're using like 3 Pyro with Bennett, Sherling, Zhongli, or you're just kind of just beating your head against the wall with Arlecchino, Bennett, Kazuha, Zhongli, or Shilonen, Zhongli. Now you'll be able to use Lanyan to replace that Kazuha, and it'll give you a shielder. Now, the size of her shield isn't as big as Zhongli. However, her C2 makes it so as long as her shield isn't completely broken, normal attacking restores 40% of the shield's HP, up to once every 2 seconds. So as long as you don't take enough damage all at once for your shield to break, it probably won't. Citlali is a cryo catalyst fielder whose main gimmick is that her shield scales with EM, and she has a little bit of damage based on her EM, and she shreds pyro and hydro resistance. That means that in those mono pyro teams like the Arlecchino team, right, you'll be able to use Citlali as a shielder that gives you shred, like Zhongli. But on top of that, she has TDDS, she has more personal damage, and she'll enable you to get a couple melts at the very least. From what I've seen, it looks like her application is good enough that if you time your stuff properly, you can melt most of the meltable hits on Arlecchino, but it's very timing dependent, so it's not guaranteed, and I'm not really assuming that you'll be able to consistently. Oh yeah, on top of that, she's a not one character, which means she can use the Scrolls of Cinder City set, so she gives you Res Shred, TTDS, and Scrolls of Cinder City, on top of giving you a little bit of reaction damage. That means there's 2 new characters, 2 new shielders that are going to be coming out soon that will take Zhongli's place in some of these teams where Zhongli is currently the better shield option, or at least the most comfortable one. Because of that, I think Zhongli's value is gonna go down a lot next patch, but he's still a more generic option that can fit in many more different teams than those two upcoming shielders. So if you're only gonna ever have one shielder, having a universal one that works pretty much anywhere is gonna feel pretty nice. That being said, honestly, I'm more and more leaning towards Zhongli not being that great of a unit. Next up, we can talk about the 4-stars on this banner. We have Heizou, Fischl, and Yaoyao. All three of those 4-stars are actually pretty good. Heizou he's a sort of character where, like, you're not gonna play Heizou. Heizou's not a character you'll actually play on like an account where you actually have options, but he's actually pretty good. The reason why you're not gonna play Heizou isn't because he's bad, it's because he has a lot of role overlap with other characters that are better than he is. But in a vacuum, how strong are teams where you're using him? They're strong. As long as you're not trying to play carry Heizou, which is not great. If you're playing Heizou as a VV shredder that can run TDDS, he's actually fairly strong. It's just, well, so can Sucrose, and she's better. Because of that, Heizou is one of those characters where, like, you're not really too happy to see him on a banner unless you just like him, which is possible. If you just like him, then obviously you'll be happy to see him. But when it comes to like a meta point of view, he's a sort of character that, like, he is not a bad character, but him being on a banner is never that great of a sign. And yeah, I'm not going to get into all of his constellation stuff because I don't think they matter. C0 Heizou is an awful carry. C6 Heizou is a mediocre carry. He's never good, so meh. Yaoyao, she's a unit who I don't want to say got worse, but her value didn't really go up and we got more options and her alternatives became stronger. Initially, Yaoyao was the Dendro healer. When Baizhu came out, Yaoyao was still the Dendro healer because honestly, there wasn't much of a reason to go for Baizhu over her. However, Farina came out. The reason why Yaoyao, or there wasn't much of a reason to get Baizhu when you already had Yaoyao, is because you just didn't need that much healing. Generally don't need to heal your off-field characters, and if you do, you can use Yaoyao's burst as a panic button that's gonna full heal your team. With Farina's release, you started to actually need to heal your off-field characters. If you want to stack your fanfare on Farina, you need off-field healing, and you don't want to spend her burst uptime. You don't want to spend Farina's burst uptime on your healer healing your team. You want to spend her burst uptime dealing damage, benefiting from those fanfare stacks. And because of that, the fact that Baizhu gets pretty much a full heal to the whole team on his skill, that is instant cast, pretty much, makes him much better in Farina teams than Yaoyao is. And because of Farina's prevalence in the meta, that was enough to make Baizhu a much stronger option than Yaoyao in so many different teams. On top of that, there was also Kirara's release that gave us another 4-star Dendro character alternative for people who wanted defensive options in their, at least in their Quicken teams. And all of that meant that while Yaoyao didn't get worse herself, her options became better and more varied. And as such, nowadays, Yaoyao doesn't really see much play outside of maybe Nilo teams. She's still a good character, but she's not as valuable as she used to be. When it comes to her constellations, C1 is worthless. Technically, it's a slightly useful constellation for like Alhaitham, but you're not playing Yaoyao with Alhaitham unless you're coping. C2 doesn't really matter because restoring energy to Yaoyao doesn't really matter because her healing is so potent and her damage is so bad that building any stat other than ER on her doesn't really help at all. So you can build her full ER without losing anything, which means that restoring more energy from Constellation doesn't really give you any real upside. C3 doesn't really matter. C4 also doesn't really matter. Gives her EM, but like, eh. C5 doesn't really matter. And finally, C6 slightly increases her Dendro application. It's a relatively useful constellation, but it's not a massive deal. All in all, her constellations are relatively weak. And so once you already have her at C0, her being on a banner isn't something you're too happy to see. And finally, the real highlight of the 4-stars on this banner, Fischl. Fischl is a very strong character. To this day, Fischl is one of the most popular 4-stars. She often sees play. I think both in my submissions, right? She sees a lot of play this Abyss, but also just in general play where 4-stars tend to not be as popular because people like running shiny 5-stars a bit more when they're more casual players. Even for more casual players, right? she's still the 4th most used 4-star character. This isn't an actually very representative data set for like actually casual players. This is still a set of data from people who have 36 started this. So keep that in mind. This isn't representative of the whole player base. But the point I'm getting at is Fischl is one of the 4-star character. Oh, sorry, 5th highest. I didn't see Cookie there. 5th highest play rate 4-star character. And there's a reason for that. She's played a lot because she's really fucking good. What makes Fischl so good is that she has really short field time requirements, low ER requirements, and high damage. She mainly nowadays sees play in 2 team archetypes. She sees play in Quicken teams that are focused on electro carries, and she sees plays in Chivalrous teams. In Quicken teams, Fischl is really f***ing good because of her Ascension 4 passive. If your current active character triggers an electro-related reaction, her A4 will deal electro damage, and that has no ICD. The trigger rate has ICD, but the application doesn't, which means that every single one of these procs will trigger aggravate. On top of all the aggravate she's getting from Oz itself, makes her a very, very high damage off-field character in all of those aggravate teams. She's single-handedly carrying aggravate on her back. She's the reason aggravate is a strong archetype. And then in Chivalrous teams that use pyro carries, where you need an off-field electro, she tends to be the best option because she's just the one that has by far the most damage. Some people will consider Yai sometimes, but Yai's field time requirements are actually much higher than people realize, and Fischl stuff is like pretty much instant. Fischl is a character that is strong at C0, but not that strong, and where a lot of her a good amount of her constellations help her a lot. Her biggest upgrades from constellations are C3 and C6, but I think a C2 is much better than people realize. Her skill cast is actually like very often a part of setups, and increasing its AoE is a pretty big deal. But obviously, the biggest ones are C3 and C5. C3 is skill damage, but even her burst, outside of the initial damage itself, it refreshes Oz, and then Oz's damage is based off the skill damage. And then C6 is obviously the biggest one. The 2 seconds extension is arguably more important than the coordinated attacks, but the coordinated attacks do increase your elemental application. If I remember correctly, they share ICD with Oz itself, but Oz's ICD is like weird as The point is, her C6 technically increases her electro application, which obviously means more damage in aggravate teams and more overload procs if she's the trigger in overload teams. Yeah, so Fischl is a 4-hit ICD with 5 seconds time rule. It's weird, man. Usually it's 3 hits, 2.5 seconds. But yeah, so her C6 is a pretty big deal, and her constellations on the way to C6 aren't too bad. Namely, her C2, 3, and her C2 and C3. With all that being said, how good is a banner like this one? I'd say this is a slightly above average 4-star lineup, but as it turns out, a slightly above average 4-star lineup on a banner where the 5-star is Neuvillette makes this an incredibly good banner. This is a great banner for new players where you can start getting a bunch of Fischl constellations and you can get yourself a Neuvillette. And if you don't have Sucrose yet, Heizou will be able to fulfill that role in the meantime, with Yaoyao also potentially helping you enable an aggravate team. For players that aren't new, it's a bit less appealing. If you already have Fischl C6, which is more possible because she's a 1.0 character, so people that have been playing for a long while have probably pulled on a lot of banners where she was rated up already. So if you already have C6, obviously that's not great, but if you don't have C6, her being on the banner is great. Whereas both Heizou and Yaoyao won't really be helping you too much if you're not a new player. So if you're not a new player, this is still a pretty good banner because Neuvillette is there, but yeah. With that out of the way, let's talk about the weapon banner. Dragon's Bane is not great. I have to talk about it so often because Dragon's Bane is always there. Dragon's Bane is arguably the worst one of them. It's a good weapon for Hu Tao, but are you still playing Hu Tao in 2024, almost 2025? Be honest. No, I mean it's a good weapon for Hu Tao, but if you're a battle pass buyer, it's worse than Battle of the Fjords. It's also often worse than Deathmatch. It's a good weapon for Xiangling, but it's worse than Catch. It's a good weapon on EM Raiden, but refines on it don't matter, and do you really not have a single Dragon's Bane yet? Doesn't tend to be the greatest. Favonia's Greatsword, there's not really a lot of good Claymore characters, And the ones we have are generally pretty happy with one of the craftables. You look at like Ito and Noel, they'd rather run White Blind than any of the banner weapons. Look at Beto, probably just want to run Tidal Shadow. Technically, if you have High Refined Akamaru, you can run that, but yeah, there are none of the claymores are like all that useful. But because none of them are all that useful, I'd argue that it's either Sack or Fav that's the best claymore of them, but it really doesn't matter that much. Then Sacrificial Fragments is pretty good weapon to have on a weapon banner. I mean, there's a few good catalysts, right? Fav Codex, Widsith, and Sacrificial Fragments are all pretty useful, but it's all in all not all that important. It's a fine weapon, but nothing more than that. Mitternachts Waltz is arguably the worst weapon in the game. It'll never be good. The biggest issue is that, well, we don't have a physical bow user. It's supposed to be a Fischl's signature, but Fischl's normal attacks are ass. And out of all the weapon types, other than maybe Catalyst, bows are probably the ones that would have the biggest sort of challenges if they were to make a physical character with that weapon type, because bow normal attacks are inherently single target. And so I think a bow physical user is the least likely out of all of the weapon types. So I don't see Mitternachts Waltz getting better in the future. Although that's just speculation, I could be wrong. And finally, we have Favonia's Sword. Best 4-star weapon in the game. I wish I had more of them. I need it. I really need it. I really need it. I might pull on this banner just for the 5-sword. I'm kidding. I won't. But yeah, 5-sword is obviously great. The best sword to have on a weapon banner. And yeah, it's good. You love to see it. Then the 5 stars. Tome of the Eternal Flow is a great weapon on Neuvillette. However, it isn't necessarily that great. The main obstacle to Tome of Eternal Flow is that Sacrificial Jade is such a strong weapon if you have refines on it. So if you're a Battle Pass buyer, you get a lot of value out of Sac Jade on Neuvillette. And because Neuvillette's best team is with Farina, and Farina generates a good amount of hydro particles, the energy restoration you get from his signature, and alternatively also from Prototype Amber, in Farina teams tends to matter a lot less because his ER requirements just aren't that high. Because of that, Tome of Eternal Flow is a relatively minor upgrade over Sacrificial Jade in Neuvillette's best teams. In those best teams, you're also only getting 2 out of 3 stacks, which makes his Constellation 1 a much bigger upgrade than the Tome of Eternal Flow. Obviously, if you don't buy the Battle Pass, then this won't matter for you, but I think a lot of the people that consider going on weapon banners are Battle Pass buyers. So that's why I think it's worth mentioning. All in all, between C1 and R1 on Neuvillette, I would say that C1 is better if you have Farina, and R1 is better if you don't. However, Vortex Vanquisher is complete and utter ass. It is a worthless weapon. They always put Vortex Vanquisher on banner when Zhongli's there, which is weird because it's a terrible weapon for Zhongli. It's an attack polearm, which means that it only works on attack scaling characters, and it's often worse or like about as good as the best free-to-play option, even with a shield. So it's an awful weapon, and you should not be happy getting it. And because of that, I would honestly lean more towards C1 for Neuvillette, even if you don't have Farina. This weapon banner just really ass. But yeah, so all in all, this is a significantly above average banner, in my opinion. This one is about average, and this one is significantly below average. But yeah, so that's gonna do it for the banner review. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.